Margaret Blackwood stood at the wooden fence of her modest farmhouse, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the dewy grass. At 45, she found herself at an unexpected crossroads, the weight of solitude pressing against her chest like a heavy autumn blanket. The small farm in Yorkshire, with its weathered buildings and single dairy cow, was all that remained of her 20-year marriage to Richard, a successful businessman who had traded their shared life for a sleek flat in London. The late September. The air carried a crisp bite, making her pull her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Daisy, the brown and white Holstein cow, mooed softly from her pen, her gentle eyes watching Margaret with what seemed like understanding. "At least I've got you," Margaret whispered, managing a small smile. Inside the farmhouse, a stack of unopened bills sat on the kitchen table, their white edges gleaming accusingly in the morning light. Margaret hadn't worked outside their home since her wedding day, when Richard had insisted she focus on being the perfect wife. Now those years of domestic expertise felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. She went through her morning routine, milking Daisy, a skill she'd learned from old Mr. Peters before he sold them the farm. Her hands moved with growing confidence, finding a rhythm in the repetitive motion. The fresh milk streamed into the steel bucket, its sweet scent rising in the cool air. Back in the kitchen, Margaret poured herself a cup of tea, adding a splash of Daisy's fresh milk. The richness of it surprised her, as it did every morning. It was different from the shop-bought milk she'd used in London, creamier, with a subtle sweetness that lingered on her tongue. Her grandmother's old recipe box sat in the corner of the kitchen counter, its wooden surface worn smooth by decades of use. Margaret ran her fingers over the lid, remembering Sunday afternoons spent watching her grandmother transform simple ingredients into magnificent creations. The box had been her grandmother's parting gift, pressed into her hands with a knowing smile at her wedding. Opening it now, Margaret leafed through the yellowed recipe cards, each one covered in her grandmother's elegant handwriting. She paused at one marked, "Traditional Yorkshire Farmhouse Cheese." The memory of her grandmother's cheese board during holiday gatherings surfaced, the variety of textures and flavors that had always impressed their guests. A sudden knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Outside stood Mrs. Rose Hampton, her 80-year-old neighbor from the farm down the lane. The elderly woman's eyes twinkled with warmth despite the early hour. "Brought you some fresh scones," Mrs. Hampton said, holding out a cloth-covered basket. "Thought you might fancy some company with your morning tea." Margaret welcomed her in, grateful for the interruption to her solitary thoughts. As they settled at the kitchen table, Mrs. Hampton's eyes fell on the recipe box. "Your Gran's recipes?" she asked, nodding toward the open box. She was known for her cheese, wasn't she? Used to win prizes at the county fair, if I remember right. Margaret nodded, pouring tea for her guest. "I was just looking at her cheese recipe, actually. Daisy's milk is so lovely, I thought perhaps—" "That cow of yours does produce exceptional milk," Mrs. Hampton agreed, stirring a spoonful of honey into her tea. "You know, I learned a thing or two about cheese making in my younger days. My mother insisted all Hampton women know how to run a proper dairy." Something stirred in Margaret's chest, a flutter of possibility she hadn't felt since the divorce papers were signed. She glanced at the recipe card again, then at the fresh milk cooling on the counter. "Would you—" Margaret hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "Would you be willing to teach me? About cheese-making, I mean." Mrs. Hampton's face lit up with a smile that erased decades from her features. "Oh, my dear, I thought you'd never ask. There's nothing quite like creating something with your own hands, you know. Nothing quite like it at all." As they chatted, over scones and tea, Margaret felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't expected to find on this small farm. Hope. Perhaps this unexpected twist in her life's path wasn't an ending after all, but rather the beginning of something entirely new. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity to Margaret's small farm. Each morning she rose before dawn, the autumn chill nipping at her heels as she made her way to Daisy's pen. The routine of milking became a meditation, a quiet time, when her mind could wander freely through the possibilities that lay ahead. Mrs. Hampton proved to be a patient teacher, arriving 3 times a week with her ancient cheese-making tools and decades of wisdom. They started small, with a simple, fresh cheese that required minimal aging. Margaret's kitchen filled with new scents and sounds, the gentle bubbling of warming milk, the soft splash of careful stirring, the sharp tang of cultures working their magic. The secret, Mrs. Hampton explained one morning, demonstrating the proper way to cut curds, isn't just in the recipe. It's in understanding the milk itself. Every batch is different. Every day brings its own challenges. You must learn to feel the changes, to adapt. Margaret absorbed every word, her hands growing steadier with each attempt. Her first few batches were far from perfect, too soft, too dry, too bland. But with each failure came new understanding. Each mistake a lesson carefully noted in the journal she'd begun keeping. The old barn, which had stood empty since her arrival, slowly transformed into a makeshift dairy. Margaret spent her evenings scrubbing its wooden surfaces until they gleamed, reading about proper sanitation methods and sketching plans for simple cheese storage shelves. Her savings dwindled as she purchased basic equipment, but each investment felt right, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. One Saturday morning, as Margaret worked on her 6th batch of cheese, Mrs. Hampton arrived with an unexpected guest, her friend Mrs. Clark, who owned the local grocery shop in the village. "Rose tells me you're making cheese," Mrs. Clark said, settling at the kitchen table. Her sharp eyes took in the newly installed thermometer and the careful arrangement of tools. "My customers have been asking for local products. The tourists especially, they love anything authentic, you see." Margaret's heart quickened. "It's still early days," she said carefully, stirring the warming milk. "I'm just learning." "Nonsense," Mrs. Hampton interjected. "Show her yesterday's batch, Margaret. The one with the herbs." With slightly trembling hands, Margaret brought out the small wheel of cheese she'd made the previous day, flavored with fresh herbs from her garden. Mrs. Clark cut a small piece, her expression neutral. As she tasted it, "Well," she said after a moment, "it's not perfect." Margaret's heart sank, but Mrs. Clark wasn't finished. "But it's honest cheese, made with good milk and care. My customers would appreciate that. When you're ready to sell, come and see me." After the visitors left, Margaret sat in her garden watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The possibility of actually selling her cheese hadn't felt real until now. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. That evening, she called her sister Claire in Manchester. "I might have found a way," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "To make this farm work, I mean." "You've always been clever with food," Claire replied warmly. "Remember how you used to help Gran with her Christmas hampers? Everyone fought over them." The conversation continued as darkness fell, and Margaret found herself sharing her hopes and fears with her sister. The worries about money, the uncertainty of starting a business, the nagging fear that she was fooling herself. "Richard always said I was impractical," she admitted quietly, "that I lived in a fantasy world." "Richard," Claire said firmly, "doesn't know everything. Look at you now, learning new skills, making plans. That seems very practical to me." After hanging up, Margaret walked to the barn. The evening air was heavy with the scent of approaching rain. Inside, her small wheels of cheese sat on their wooden boards, each one marked with the date and type. In the dim light, they looked like stepping stones, leading her towards something new. She touched one of the wheels gently, feeling the slightly waxy surface beneath her fingers. Tomorrow, she would need to turn them, check their progress, adjust the temperature and humidity. Small steps, but important ones. Like her grandmother always said, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single cheese." Margaret smiled at her own adaptation of the old saying. Perhaps she was being impractical. Perhaps this whole endeavor would fail. But for the first time since the divorce, she felt truly alive, truly herself. And that, she decided, was worth any risk. The November winds swept across Yorkshire with particular ferocity that year, rattling the barn's old windows as Margaret labored over her latest batch of cheese. 3 months had passed since her first attempts, and her small dairy operation was slowly taking shape. The barn, once musty and abandoned, now housed neat rows of aging cheese wheels, each carefully marked and dated. Mrs. Clark had begun selling Margaret's cheese at her village shop 2 weeks ago, starting with a modest display near the counter. The first batch had sold out in 3 days, surprising both women. "They're asking when we'll have more," Mrs. Clark had said, counting out Margaret's earnings, especially the herb-flavored ones. But success, even small success, brought its own challenges. Margaret's kitchen equipment, adequate for initial experiments, now struggled to keep up with increased production. The old refrigerator hummed constantly, working overtime to maintain proper temperatures. Her arms ached from hand-stirring larger batches, and she'd already broken 2 thermometers. One particularly cold morning, as Margaret struggled with an unwieldy pot of milk, she heard familiar footsteps on the gravel path. Mrs. Hampton appeared in the doorway, bringing with her the scent of wood smoke and lavender. "For you'll put your back out lifting those heavy pots," the older woman observed, watching Margaret's careful movements. "Come sit for a moment. I've brought news you'll want to hear." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, grateful for the break. Her mentor's eyes twinkled with barely contained excitement as they settled at the kitchen table. "The winter fair is coming up," Mrs. Hampton announced, pulling a colorful flyer from her bag. "They're looking for local producers to set up stalls. It's quite popular, brings people from all over the county." Margaret's heart jumped. The Yorkshire Winter Fair was a prestigious event, known for showcasing the region's finest artisanal products. "But I'm just starting out," she protested. "My cheese isn't ready for something like that." "Nonsense," Mrs. Hampton replied firmly. "Your grandmother exhibited there every year, you know. Won prizes too, it's in your blood." Before Margaret could respond, a loud mooing from outside interrupted their conversation. They rushed to the barn where they found Daisy lying in her pen, clearly distressed. "Ah," Mrs. Hampton said softly, her experienced eyes taking in the situation. "Looks like your girl's time has come a bit early." The next few hours passed, in a blur of activity. The local vet arrived, confirming what Mrs. Hampton had already known. Daisy was in labor. Margaret stayed by her cow's side, stroking her head and murmuring encouragement, while Mrs. Hampton coordinated with the vet. As the winter sun began to set, painting the barn in soft golden light, a healthy female calf entered the world. Margaret watched in wonder as Daisy tenderly nuzzled her newborn, helping her stand on wobbly legs. "Well," the vet said, packing up his equipment, "you've got yourself a fine pair there. The little one looks strong." That evening, after ensuring both mother and calf were comfortable, Margaret sat in her kitchen with Mrs. Hampton, sharing a pot of tea and leftover shepherd's pie. "I'll need to name her," Margaret mused, thinking of the tiny calf. "The little one, I mean." "Hope," Mrs. Hampton suggested simply. "She came just when you needed her." Margaret nodded, feeling the rightness of the name settle in her chest. With 2 cows, she could expand her cheese production naturally, gradually. The timing couldn't have been better, with the winter fair approaching. Later that night, unable to sleep, Margaret bundled up and returned to the barn. Daisy and Hope lay curled together in the fresh straw, peaceful under the soft barn lights. In the aging room next door, her cheese wheels sat in neat rows, each one representing hours of learning, of trying, of refusing to give up. She picked up her journal, adding notes about the day's events. The pages were filled now with recipes, observations, and lessons learned. Alongside the technical details, she'd started recording her feelings too. Her fears, her small victories, her growing dreams. Opening her grandmother's recipe box, Margaret pulled out a worn card she hadn't noticed before. It contained instructions for a special celebration cheese, one made with rich winter milk and aged for exactly 6 weeks. The timing would be perfect for the winter fair. Standing in the quiet barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of her sleeping animals and the familiar scent of aging cheese, Margaret felt a surge of certainty. She would enter the winter fair. She would take this chance, this opportunity to share what she'd created. Outside, the winter wind continued to blow, but inside the barn remained warm and safe, filled with new life and possibilities. Margaret smiled, thinking of her grandmother's words written at the bottom of the recipe card. Made with love, aged with patience, shared with joy. As December approached, word about Margaret's cheese spread through the village like honey on warm bread. Mrs. Clark's shop could barely keep up with demand, and several local restaurants had begun asking about regular orders. But not all the attention was positive. "Did you hear?" Margaret overheard one morning at the village shop. "She's entering the winter fair. Rather ambitious for someone who's only been making cheese for a few months, don't you think?" The speaker was Patricia Wilton, owner of the neighboring farm and self-proclaimed expert on local traditions. Her sharp voice carried across the shop, clearly meant to be heard. "I heard she doesn't even have proper certification," Patricia continued. "Making cheese in that old barn of hers hardly seems safe if you ask me." Margaret's cheeks burned as she pretended to study the display of local jams. Patricia's words struck at her deepest insecurities, but they also sparked something else: determination. That afternoon, she drove to the local library and checked out every book they had on food safety regulations and certification requirements. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of preparation. During the day, Margaret continued her regular cheese-making routine, now adjusted to accommodate both Daisy and Hope's schedules. The young calf was growing quickly, her playful nature bringing unexpected joy to the daily farm tasks. In the evenings, Margaret pored over regulations and requirements, making detailed lists of necessary upgrades. Her savings would be stretched thin, but she knew she couldn't ignore these essential improvements. Mrs. Hampton visited regularly, bringing not only her expertise, but also news from her vast network of local connections. "Old William from the Gee hardware shop has some food-grade shelving he's willing to sell at half price," she announced one day. "And my nephew can help install proper ventilation in the barn. He's a qualified tradesman, you know." The village seemed to divide into two camps: those who supported Margaret's endeavor and those who listened to Patricia's whispered concerns. But Margaret kept her focus on her work, refusing to be drawn into village politics. One frosty morning, as Margaret worked on her special batch for the winter fair, she received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Wilton, Patricia's teenage daughter, stood awkwardly at the barn door, her school bag clutched tightly. The girl started, then stopped, gathering courage. "I have a project for school, about local businesses. I wondered if I could interview you?" Margaret gestured for Sarah to come in, noting how the girl's eyes widened at the sight of the neat rows of aging cheese. As they talked, Sarah's initial nervousness gave way to genuine curiosity. She asked thoughtful questions about the cheese-making process, carefully noting Margaret's answers. "Mum says this isn't a proper business," Sarah said suddenly, then blushed. "But I think it's brilliant. You're making something real, something special." Margaret studied the young girl, seeing past her surface resemblance to Patricia. "Would you like to learn how it's done?" she offered impulsively. "You could help me prepare for the winter fair." Sarah's face lit up. "Really? But Mum—" "We'll talk to her together," Margaret promised. "This could be part of your school project. Practical research." To Margaret's surprise, Patricia agreed, though not without conditions. She's to be home by 5, and if her grades slip even slightly. Sarah proved to be an eager student, absorbing information like a sponge. Her presence brought fresh energy to the barn, and her questions often made Margaret think about her processes in new ways. As the winter fair drew closer, Margaret's special batch of celebration cheese matured beautifully. The rich winter milk from both Daisy and Hope had given it a depth of flavor that exceeded her expectations. The barn transformation continued, with new shelving, proper ventilation, and updated equipment gradually replacing the makeshift solutions she'd started with. Each improvement brought her closer to proper certification, though the process was far from complete. One evening, as Margaret walked Sarah home, they passed Patricia in her garden. The older woman paused in her pruning, watching them approach. Sarah was chattering excitedly about their latest cheese experiment, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. "She hasn't talked about anything else for weeks," Patricia said quietly to Margaret, as Sarah ran ahead. "I haven't seen her this interested in something since, well, in quite a while." It wasn't quite an apology, but Margaret recognized the olive branch for what it was. "She has a real talent for it," she replied carefully, "a natural instinct for the process." Patricia nodded slowly, then turned back to her roses. But the next day, a basket of fresh herbs appeared on Margaret's doorstep, Patricia's garden was famous for its herb collection. Attached was a note. "These might work well in your cheese for the winter fair." Margaret smiled, adding the herbs to her grandmother's recipe. Sometimes, she was learning, success wasn't just about what you made. It was about the bridges you built along the way. The Yorkshire Winter Fair transformed the village's community centre into a bustling marketplace. Fairy lights twinkled from wooden beams, and the air carried the mingled scents of mulled wine, fresh bread, and local delicacies. Margaret stood behind her carefully arranged stall, her heart pounding beneath her new apron, a gift from Sarah, hand-embroidered with Blackwood Farm artisan cheese. Her display told the story of her journey. Photographs of Daisy and Hope grazing in the morning mist, carefully labelled cheese samples arranged on her grandmother's old wooden boards, and a small sign explaining the traditional methods she used. The celebration cheese held pride of place, its dark wax coating gleaming under the lights. "You've done your grandmother proud," Mrs. Hampton said, adjusting the position of a cheese board slightly. "Now remember, let people taste at their own pace. The cheese will speak for itself." The fair opened its doors, and visitors began streaming in. Margaret watched anxiously as the first few people approached her stall, trying to gauge their reactions. Sarah, who had insisted on helping, handled the samples with professional grace, sharing stories about the cheese-making process with genuine enthusiasm. "Remarkable depth of flavor," commented an elderly gentleman, closing his eyes as he savored a piece of the celebration cheese. "Reminds me of the artisanal cheeses I tried in France." A small crowd gathered, drawn by the positive reactions, save early tasters. Margaret found herself sharing her story again and again, how she'd started with one cow and an old recipe box, how each cheese represented hours of learning and adjusting. Midway through the morning, a tall man in a chef's coat approached the stall. He tried each variety methodically, making notes in a small notebook. "The combination of traditional methods and innovative flavor profiles is intriguing," he said finally, introducing himself as James Barrett, head chef at the Golden Oak in Leeds. "We've been looking for unique local products for our menu." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she wrote down his contact information. The Golden Oak was one of Yorkshire's most prestigious restaurants, known for championing regional producers. As the day progressed, more restaurant owners and food buyers visited her stall. Each positive comment helped ease the knot of anxiety in her chest, replacing it with cautious pride. Even Patricia Wilton stopped by, purchasing a wheel of the celebration cheese with a small nod of approval. Late in the afternoon, a representative from Woolworth's Fine Foods, an upmarket grocery chain, expressed interest in stocking her cheese in their Yorkshire branches. "We could take your entire production," he said, sliding his business card across the counter. "Our customers love authentic local products." The offer was flattering, but something about it made Margaret hesitate. The thought of mass-producing her cheese, of losing the personal touch that made each wheel unique, sat uneasily in her stomach. "I'll need to think about it," she said carefully, tucking the card away. The representative looked surprised. Clearly, he wasn't used to suppliers needing time to consider his offers. As the fair wound down, Sarah helped Margaret pack up their remaining stock, which wasn't much. They'd sold almost everything they'd brought. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing discreetly across the hall. A group of judges was making their way through the stalls, marking their scorecards. Margaret held her breath as they approached her stand. The head judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, spent several minutes examining the celebration cheese, asking detailed questions about the aging process and milk sources. The award ceremony wasn't until tomorrow, but Margaret already felt like a winner. She'd faced her fears, shared her cheese with hundreds of people, and received validation from food professionals. The nervous woman who'd stood behind the stall that morning felt like a stranger now. Back at the farm that evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen with Mrs. Hampton and Sarah, sharing a pot of tea and the last pieces of display cheese. The barn was quiet except for the occasional moo from Daisy or Hope, and the winter sky outside was clear and star-filled. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Mrs. Hampton said, patting Margaret's hand, "you've built something special here. Something real." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "And did you see how many people asked about farm visits? We could do tours, maybe even cheese-making workshops." Margaret smiled at the girl's enthusiasm, but her mind was already turning over new possibilities. The day had shown her that there was a real appetite for traditional, handcrafted cheese. But it had also reminded her why she'd fallen in love with cheese-making in the first place. The connection to the land, to tradition, to the people who appreciated food made with care and attention. Looking at her grandmother's recipe box, still sitting in its place of honor on the kitchen shelf, Margaret felt a surge of gratitude. This small farm, which had once seemed like the end of her story, had turned out to be just the beginning. The morning after the winter fair brought news that set the village buzzing. Margaret's celebration cheese had won not only the category for new producers, but also the overall Best in Show award. The judges praised its exceptional character and perfect balance of tradition and innovation. Local papers sent photographers to capture Margaret with her prizes, and suddenly, her quiet farm became the center of attention. Mrs. Clark's shop sold out of Blackwood Farm cheese within hours of opening, and her phone rang constantly with inquiries from restaurants and shops across Yorkshire. "You'll need to expand," Patricia Wilton said matter-of-factly, appearing at Margaret's door one morning. "I've got 2 dairy cows I'm looking to sell. Good breeding, excellent milk producers." She paused, then added, "Sarah told me about the Woolworths offer." Margaret invited her neighbour in, surprising both of them. Over tea, they discussed the challenges of maintaining quality while growing a business. Patricia's experience running a large farm proved unexpectedly valuable. "The trick is knowing what to keep personal and what to delegate," Patricia advised. "My husband wanted to industrialize everything when we inherited the farm. I had to fight to keep our traditional methods." The following weeks tested Margaret's organizational skills as she juggled increasing demands. Chef Barrett from the Golden Oak became a regular visitor, working with her to develop exclusive cheese varieties for his restaurant. His enthusiasm for traditional methods matched her own, and their collaboration led to innovative combinations of local ingredients. Sarah continued to help after school, now joined by 2 other young women from the village who were eager to learn the craft. The barn hummed with activity as Margaret passed on the techniques Mrs. Hampton had taught her, adding her own discoveries to the traditional methods. But the Woolworths offer lingered in her mind. The representative called regularly, each time, increasing the proposed order size and offering assistance with modernizing her production facilities. The money would solve many problems. She could upgrade her equipment, hire more help, maybe even buy Patricia's cows. One quiet Sunday morning, Margaret sat in her garden watching Hope chase butterflies while Daisy grazed nearby. The morning sun caught the dew on the grass, turning each drop into a tiny diamond. The scene reminded her of those first uncertain days after Richard left, when this small farm had seemed like a consolation prize rather than an opportunity. Mrs. Hampton found her there, bringing her usual basket of scones and wisdom. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, settling into the other garden chair. Margaret shared her concerns about expansion. "The Woolworths contract would secure the farm's future," she said, "but mass production, it feels like betraying something important." "Your grandmother faced similar choices," Mrs. Hampton revealed, surprising Margaret. "Big companies wanted her cheese too, but she chose to keep it small, personal, said the magic wasn't in how much you made, but in how much love you put into each batch." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Chef Barrett pulled up in his car, practically bouncing with excitement. "You'll never guess who came to the restaurant last night," he announced. "A food writer from The Guardian. She adored your cheese, wants to feature you in her article about artisanal food producers who are preserving traditional methods." The news should have been thrilling, but it added to Margaret's sense of standing at a crossroads. More publicity would mean more demand, more pressure to expand. The simple life she'd been building felt suddenly fragile. Later that day, as Margaret worked in the barn with her small team, she watched how Sarah carefully turned each cheese, how Lucy from the village post office monitored the aging room's temperature with complete concentration, how Emma, Patricia's niece, meticulously recorded each batch's progress. The scene struck her with unexpected clarity. This wasn't just about making cheese anymore. It was about preserving knowledge, building connections, creating opportunities for others to learn and grow. The magic her grandmother had talked about wasn't just in the cheese, it was in the community that had grown around it. That evening, Margaret wrote 2 letters. The first to the Woolworths representative, politely declining their offer. The second to her solicitor, outlining her plans to establish a small cheese-making school alongside her production facility. As she sealed the envelopes, Margaret felt lighter than she had in weeks. The path ahead might not be the most profitable, but it felt right. She was no longer just making cheese. She was continuing a tradition, building a legacy, creating something that mattered. Outside, the spring evening was drawing in, bringing with it the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers. Margaret stood in her doorway, watching the sun set behind her small but thriving farm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to grow and learn. But for now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Spring melted into summer, bringing with it unexpected discoveries. While clearing space in the barn's dusty attic for additional storage, Margaret and Sarah uncovered a treasure trove. Behind old boxes and farming equipment lay a collection of Victorian-era cheese-making tools and, most intriguingly, a leather-bound journal dated 1876. "Look at this," Margaret breathed, carefully turning the journal's fragile pages. The neat handwriting detailed something extraordinary, a unique cheese aging technique that utilized the natural limestone caves beneath the Yorkshire Hills. The journal belonged to the farm's original owner, Elizabeth Blackwood, no relation to Margaret, but a woman who had faced similar challenges in her time. She used the cave's natural temperature and humidity, Margaret explained to Mrs. Hampton later that day. But there was more to it. She found that certain areas of the cave produced distinct flavors in the cheese. The discovery sparked an idea. The old maps in Elizabeth's journal showed a small cave system extending beneath Margaret's property. With Sarah's help, she located the original entrance, hidden behind decades of overgrowth near the edge of her land. Local authorities confirmed the caves were safe and, after proper inspection, granted permission for their use in cheese production. The process of preparing the caves was painstaking, but Margaret felt a deep connection to Elizabeth as she followed the detailed instructions in the journal. "It's like she left this for us to find," Sarah said, helping to install modern monitoring equipment alongside the traditional aging racks. "Like she knew someone would need it someday." The first batch of cave-aged cheese was an experiment. Margaret selected several wheels of her standard recipe, aging half in the traditional barn facility and half in different sections of the cave. The waiting period tested her patience, but Elizabeth's journal had emphasized the importance of time in developing complex flavors. When Chef Barrett visited to check on their progress, he brought news of his own. "The Guardian article has gone viral," he announced. "Everyone's talking about traditional Yorkshire cheese making. You've started quite a movement." Indeed, Margaret had noticed more visitors to the area, often stopping by her farm shop, a recent addition run by Emma with impressive efficiency. Many were small-scale food producers seeking advice on traditional methods. The day finally came to taste the cave-aged cheese. Margaret assembled a small group: Mrs. Hampton, Chef Barrett, Sarah, and, to everyone's surprise, Patricia Wilton, who had become an unexpected ally in navigating local agricultural regulations. The difference was remarkable. The cave-aged cheese had developed a complexity of flavor that left them speechless. Each section of the cave had produced slightly different notes. One batch was nutty and intense, another smooth and subtle. "This isn't just cheese," Chef Barrett said finally. "This is history coming alive, a taste of Yorkshire that's been sleeping for over a century." The success of the cave-aged cheese led to Margaret's next innovation. Working with local historians and food scientists, she developed a mapping system for the cave's different aging zones, each producing its own unique flavor profile. The project combined traditional knowledge with modern understanding of aging conditions. Word spread quickly through the culinary world. Food writers and cheese experts began making pilgrimages to the small Yorkshire farm where traditional methods were being reborn. Margaret found herself sharing not just cheese-making techniques, but Elizabeth's story as well. She was ahead of her time, Margaret told a visiting food historian. She understood that this wasn't just about making cheese. It was about working with the land, understanding its secrets. The cave discovery transformed more than just her cheese. It gave the farm a unique identity, a connection to history. That set it apart from other artisanal producers. Margaret began offering limited tours of the aging caves, carefully preserving their delicate environment while sharing their story. One evening, as Margaret added her own notes to Elizabeth's journal, documenting the effects of different cave sections on various cheese types, she realized something profound. She wasn't just continuing a tradition, she was part of a long line of women who had found their strength in these Yorkshire hills. Sarah, who had stayed late to help document temperature readings, looked up from her notebook. "Do you ever wonder what Elizabeth would think about us using her methods again?" Margaret smiled, remembering the journal's final entry. "To whoever finds these notes, the land holds wisdom in its depths. Listen to it, learn from it, and it will provide." The caves had given her cheese something unique, something that couldn't be replicated in industrial facilities. But more than that, they had given her a sense of purpose, a feeling of continuing something precious and important. As twilight settled over the farm, Margaret stood at the cave entrance, breathing in the cool, mineral-scented air. Above her, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars Elizabeth would have seen as she perfected her aging technique all those years ago. The autumn morning brought an unexpected visitor to Blackwood Farm. Margaret was in the cave checking on a new batch of cheese when Emma came running down the stone steps. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her expression uncertain. It's Richard." Margaret's hands stilled on the cheese wheel she was turning. She hadn't seen her ex-husband since the divorce proceedings 18 months ago. Taking a deep breath, she removed her work apron and climbed back to the surface. Richard stood in the farmyard, looking oddly out of place in his expensive suit. He'd aged since she'd last seen him. New lines around his eyes, a slight graying at his temples. His usual confident stance seemed somehow diminished. "Margaret," he said, attempting a smile, "you're looking well." She was suddenly conscious of her work clothes, her hair tied back practically, the slight traces of cheese on her fingers. But unlike before, these things didn't make her feel lesser. They were badges of her new life, her independence. "What brings you to Yorkshire?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. The last she'd heard, he'd been expanding his business interests in London. "I saw the article in The Guardian," he said. "Your cheese, and it's becoming quite famous in London's food circles. Even my club has started serving it." He paused, looking around the farm. "You've done amazing things here." There was something in his tone, a note of surprise that made Margaret's spine stiffen slightly. How many times had he dismissed her ideas during their marriage, calling them impractical dreams? "I'm actually here with a proposition," Richard continued. "My investment group is interested in artisanal food products. We could provide capital for expansion, marketing support, distribution networks. Make Blackwood Farm a national brand." The offer hung in the air between them. Once, his approval would have meant everything to her. Now, she found herself thinking of Elizabeth's journal, of the cave's careful balance of conditions, of the small batches that allowed for perfect attention to detail. "Would you like a tour?" she offered instead of answering. "See what we've built here." She showed him the barn, now a proper dairy with modern equipment sitting comfortably alongside traditional tools. Sarah and Emma were working there, carefully, monitoring a new batch. They greeted Richard politely, but continued their work with practiced focus. In the cave, Chef Barrett was conducting a tasting session with a group of culinary students. His passionate explanation of the aging process echoed off the limestone walls. Richard watched, clearly impressed, as the students sampled different varieties, noting the subtle variations in flavor. "Your production capacity must be quite limited," he observed as they walked back to the farmyard. "With proper investment, you could increase output tenfold. There's a huge market for premium artisanal products." Margaret thought of the Woolworths offer she'd declined, of the choice she'd made to keep her operations small and personal. "The cave system can only handle so much," she explained. "Expanding would mean industrial aging facilities, standardized processes. But think of the possibilities, Richard pressed. The brand potential. This could be huge, Margaret. She looked around her farm, at Daisy and Hope grazing in the afternoon sun, at the students emerging from the cave full of enthusiasm, at Sarah teaching Emma's younger sister how to test milk quality. This wasn't just a business, it was a living, breathing community. I am thinking of the possibilities, she said quietly, but perhaps not the same ones you see. Richard's face fell slightly. You always were stubborn, he said, but there was something like respect in his voice. The Margaret I married would never have stood up to me like this. The Margaret you married didn't know her own strength, she replied simply. After he left, Margaret sat in her garden, processing the encounter. The old feelings of inadequacy she'd expected to surface hadn't appeared. Instead, she felt oddly grateful to Richard. His dismissal of her dreams had ultimately led her here, to this life she'd built for herself. Mrs. Hampton found her there, carrying a basket of fresh herbs from her garden. Saw a fancy car leaving, she said, settling into her usual chair. Everything all right? Margaret shared the details of Richard's visit and his offer. Mrs. Hampton listened quietly, then smiled. You know, she said, sometimes the biggest success isn't in how big something grows, but in how deep its roots go. That evening, Margaret wrote in her journal, adding her entry alongside Elizabeth's ancient notes. She wrote about choices, about staying true to one's vision, about the difference between growth and expansion. The caves below held their ancient wisdom. The cheese wheels turned slowly in their careful dance of aging, and above, the Yorkshire stars shone down on her small but perfect corner of the world. The idea came from an unexpected source. Sarah was showing a group of tourists around the cave system when one of them, a retired teacher from Bristol, asked where she could get a proper cup of tea after the tour. We could open a small cafe, Sarah suggested to Margaret later that day. Use the old stone cottage by the barn, show people how the cheese is best enjoyed, maybe serve traditional Yorkshire dishes. The suggestion took root in Margaret's mind. The cottage had stood empty since she'd arrived, its sturdy walls and large windows overlooking the rolling hills. With some renovation, it could become something special. Not just a cafe, Margaret mused, sketching ideas in her journal. A place where people can experience the whole story, from the land to the table. The project quickly became a community affair. Patricia offered furniture from her attic, including a beautiful Victorian dresser, perfect for cheese displays. Mrs. Hampton shared her collection of traditional recipes, and Chef Barrett helped design a menu that showcased local ingredients. Local craftsmen renovated the cottage, preserving its character while adding modern amenities. Margaret insisted on keeping the original stone fireplace, imagining winter afternoons with guests warming themselves by the fire while sampling cave-aged cheeses. The cafe opened on a crisp October morning. Margaret had worried about finding staff, but Sarah's friends from the village stepped forward eagerly. They transformed the cottage into a warm, welcoming space where visitors could taste cheese, learn about traditional methods, and enjoy homemade food. It's like stepping back in time, one guest wrote in the visitor's book, but with all the comfort of the present. The cafe became more than just a business venture. It turned into a gathering place where local food producers could showcase their products. The baker from the village supplied fresh bread, local beekeepers provided honey, and Patricia's herb garden contributed to the kitchen's recipes. Margaret started hosting evening events, cheese and wine pairings, traditional cooking classes, talks about Yorkshire food history. The cave tours expanded to include tastings in the cafe, creating a complete experience that drew visitors from across the country. One rainy afternoon, as Margaret watched guests chatting over steaming pots of tea and plates of local specialties, she noticed something remarkable. At one table, a young couple was deep in conversation with Mrs. Hampton about traditional farming methods. At another, Sarah was explaining cheese-making techniques to a group of interested teenagers. The farm had become more than a dairy. It was now a living museum, a place where traditional knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next. The cafe wasn't just serving food, it was serving stories, preserving a way of life that might otherwise fade away. Even the local tourism board took notice. They featured Blackwood Farm in their promotional materials, highlighting it as an example of sustainable rural tourism. School groups began visiting regularly, learning about food production and local history. "You've created something unique here," Chef Barrett said during one of his regular visits. He was hosting a special dinner event in the cafe, showcasing how traditional ingredients could be used in modern cuisine. It's not just about preserving the past, it's about making it relevant for the future. The cafe's success brought new challenges. Managing reservations, coordinating supplies, training staff, each day presented new lessons in running a hospitality business. But Margaret found she enjoyed the complexity, the way each piece had to work together smoothly. Sarah, now in her final year of school, spent every free moment at the farm. She'd developed a special talent for creating cheese boards, pairing different varieties with local honeys and preserves. Her presentations were works of art, photographed regularly by food bloggers and social media influencers. "I want to study food science at university," she announced one evening as they closed up the cafe. "Maybe find new ways to combine traditional methods with modern understanding." Margaret smiled, remembering her own journey from uncertain beginnings to confident business owner. The cafe tables were cleared, the dishes washed, the day's fresh bread stored for tomorrow. Through the windows, she could see the lights of the barn where the evening cheese-making class was still in session. A coach party had booked the entire cafe for tomorrow, a group of food writers from London. The menu was planned, featuring seasonal specialties and, of course, a carefully curated selection of cave-aged cheeses. The farm shop's shelves were stocked, the cave tours scheduled, the stories ready to be shared again. As Margaret locked up the cottage, the autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching rain. She paused for a moment, taking in the scene. Her small farm had grown into something she could never have imagined 2 years ago. Not bigger necessarily, but richer, fuller, more complete. In the gathering dusk, the lights of the cafe, barn, and farm shop created a warm glow against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep baaed softly, and closer by, she could hear Daisy and Hope settling down for the night. This, she thought, was success, not measured in pounds or volume, but in lives touched, traditions preserved, community strengthened. The Yorkshire winter arrived with a blanket of snow, transforming Blackwood Farm into a scene from a Christmas card. The cafe's windows glowed warmly against the white landscape, and the scent of mulled cider and fresh-baked scones drew visitors in from the cold. Margaret stood in the cave entrance, watching another tour group descend the stone steps. 2 years had passed since she'd first arrived at the farm, unsure and alone. Now, the cave's cool darkness felt like an old friend, its limestone walls, holding not just cheese but countless stories of transformation. The morning's post had brought a letter that sat unopened on her desk, an invitation to speak at a prestigious food conference in London. They wanted her to discuss the revival of traditional farming methods and their place in modern food production. "You'll go, won't you?" Sarah asked, finding Margaret lost in thought. The girl, young woman now really, had just received her university acceptance letter. She would study food science and business management, with plans to return to the farm after graduation. Before Margaret could answer, Mrs. Hampton arrived with news. "The Historical Society wants to register the cave system as a heritage site," she announced. "They say it's a unique example of traditional food production methods." The recognition was flattering, but it came with responsibility. Heritage status would help protect the caves for future generations, but it also meant additional regulations and oversight. Margaret spent the afternoon discussing the implications with Patricia, who had experience with listed buildings on her own farm. "It's not just about preserving the physical space," Patricia observed, watching tourists photograph the snow-covered farm buildings. "It's about keeping the knowledge alive." Indeed, the farm had become a repository of traditional wisdom. The cheese-making classes were always full, with students ranging from curious hobbyists to professional food producers. The cafe hosted regular workshops on everything from butter churning to bread baking, each session combining historical techniques with practical modern applications. That evening, As Margaret prepared for the farm's second annual winter fair, she found herself reflecting on the changes in her life. The farm shop was now a thriving business. The cafe had become a destination for food lovers, and the cheese cave tours were booked months in advance. But the real transformation wasn't in the buildings or businesses. It was in the people. Sarah had grown from a shy teenager into a confident young woman with clear goals. Emma managed the shop with impressive skill, introducing new local products and building relationships with suppliers. Even Patricia had softened, becoming a valued advisor and friend. The winter fair itself reflected these changes. What had started as a simple cheese stall had grown into a celebration of local food and traditional crafts. The cafe would serve special menus, local artisans would demonstrate their skills, and visitors would tour the caves to learn about traditional aging methods. As Margaret walked through the fairy-lit farm buildings, checking last-minute details, she remembered Richard's visit and his talk of expansion. He had seen the farm's potential in terms of profit and scale, but he had missed its true value, the way it connected people to their food, their history, their community. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Margaret stood in the farmyard, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered hills. Daisy and Hope were comfortable in their warm barn, their milk continuing to provide the foundation for every cheese the farm produced. Inside the cafe, Sarah and Emma were setting up for breakfast. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with baking bread, and the display case showcased a selection of cave-aged cheeses. On the walls, photographs told the story of the farm's journey, from a single cow and an old recipe box to a thriving agricultural business. Margaret finally opened the conference invitation, her decision already made. She would go to London, not to boast about her success, but to share what she had learned. That progress doesn't always mean getting bigger, that tradition and innovation can work hand in hand, that real wealth isn't measured in money alone. A group of early visitors arrived, stamping snow from their boots as they entered the warm cafe. Margaret welcomed them with hot tea and fresh scones, ready to share another day's stories. Through the window, she could see more cars approaching along the snow-lined drive. 2 years ago, she had stood in this same spot, wondering if she could survive on her own. Now she knew the truth. She had done more than survive. She had built something meaningful, something that would last beyond her own time. The old stones of the farm buildings, the ancient caves below, the rich traditions of Yorkshire cheesemaking, all would continue, preserved and renewed by each generation that followed. As she began her day's work, Margaret smiled, thinking of her grandmother's recipe box, still in its place of honor in the cafe. Some recipes she had learned were about more than just making food. They were about making a life, about finding the courage to begin again, about transforming the ingredients you're given into something wonderful and new. Spring returned to Yorkshire, bringing with it an unexpected proposition. A television production company had heard about Blackwood Farm through the London Food Conference and wanted to feature it in a documentary series about traditional British food producers. Margaret sat in the cafe with the production team, sharing the story of her journey, while Sarah served them samples of the latest cave-aged cheese. Through their questions, she began to see her experience through fresh eyes, not just as a personal triumph, but as an example of how traditional methods could thrive in the modern world. "We'd like to film through the seasons," the director explained, showing the full cycle of cheese production from grazing to aging. "But what really interests us is the community you've built here." Indeed, the farm had become a hub of activity. Local women had started bringing traditional family recipes to test in the cafe kitchen. A group of retired craftsmen offered workshops on everything from dry stone walling to traditional woodworking. School children came to learn about sustainable farming practices. The filming began as spring flowers bloomed across the Yorkshire hills. The camera crew captured the daily rhythm of farm life, the early morning milking, the careful cheese-making process, the steady stream of visitors to the cafe and shop. But they also caught the smaller moments. Mrs. Hampton teaching a group of young mothers her secret scone recipe, Patricia sharing her knowledge of herb cultivation with visiting gardeners, Sarah explaining the science of cheese-making to fascinated children. One morning, as Margaret walked through the dew-dampened grass to the barn, she noticed something remarkable. Wild strawberries had begun growing near the cave entrance, their tiny white flowers dotting the ground. She remembered reading in Elizabeth's journal about these same strawberries growing there a century ago, nature's own continuity. The documentary crew was particularly interested in the cave system. They brought special lighting equipment to capture the rows of aging cheese, the ancient limestone walls, the careful balance of temperature and humidity that created the perfect aging conditions. "It's like a cathedral," the director commented, watching his camera operator film the vaulted cave ceiling. A cathedral dedicated to traditional food making. The comparison struck Margaret as oddly appropriate. The caves did have a sacred quality, not just in their impressive architecture, but in the way they preserved and enhanced the work of human hands, the way they connected past and present. As filming progressed, more visitors arrived at the farm, drawn by word of mouth and growing media attention. Margaret hired 2 more local women to help in the cafe, and Emma took on an apprentice in the shop. The farm's success was creating ripples through the community, providing opportunities that hadn't existed before. One sunny afternoon, Margaret found a young couple waiting to speak with her after a cave tour. The woman, she learned, had inherited a small farm in Devon and wanted advice about starting her own artisanal food business. "We've been to several large dairy operations," her husband explained, "but they all told us we'd need massive investment, industrial equipment. Then we heard about what you'd built here." Margaret spent the afternoon sharing her experience with them, not just the practical aspects of running a small dairy, but the importance of staying true to traditional methods while adapting to modern needs. She found herself remembering her own uncertain beginnings, the fears she'd overcome, the lessons she'd learned. That evening, after the film crew had packed up their equipment and the last visitors had left, Margaret sat in her garden with Mrs. Hampton and Patricia. The 3 women watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, while sheep grazed peacefully in the distant fields. "You've started something here," Patricia said thoughtfully, "something bigger than just making cheese." Mrs. Hampton nodded in agreement. "You've shown people there's another way, that bigger isn't always better, that old wisdom still has value." Margaret thought about the young couple from Devon, about Sarah's plans for university, about all the people who had found inspiration or opportunity through her small farm. The documentary would spread these ideas further, perhaps sparking similar initiatives in other communities. As dusk settled over the farm, the lights in the cafe windows glowed warmly, and the sweet scent of wild strawberries drifted up from the cave entrance. This place, which had once seemed like the end of her dreams, had instead become a beginning, not just for her but for others who dared to imagine a different kind of success. The Yorkshire summer brought long, golden evenings and a steady stream of visitors to Blackwood Farm. 2 years had passed since Margaret had first stood alone in the farmyard, clutching her grandmother's recipe box and wondering how to begin again. Now, on a warm Saturday afternoon, she watched from the cafe window as Sarah conducted a cheese-making workshop in the converted barn. The young woman moved with confidence among her students, her passion for the craft evident in every gesture. In a few weeks she would leave for university, but her heart would remain tied to the farm that had shaped her future. The documentary about Blackwood Farm had aired the previous month, bringing a new wave of interest. But what touched Margaret most were the letters that arrived afterward. From other women starting their own businesses, from young people interested in traditional farming methods, from communities trying to preserve their food heritage. "We're going to need a bigger postbox," Emma joked, bringing in another stack of correspondence. The farm shop manager had developed a remarkable talent for connecting with customers, turning casual visitors into regular buyers who valued the story behind each product. Margaret had just finished responding to the morning's letters when Mrs. Hampton arrived with unexpected news. The Yorkshire Agricultural Society wanted to establish a scholarship program for young people interested in traditional farming methods, and they wanted to name it after Blackwood Farm. "They say you've created a model for sustainable rural business," Mrs. Hampton explained, settling into her usual chair by the cafe fireplace. "They want to help others follow your example." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She, who had once doubted her ability to run even the smallest business, was now being held up as an example to others. But she understood that what she'd created wasn't just about business success. It was about proving that traditional values and modern life could coexist and enrich each other. That evening, Margaret hosted a special dinner in the cafe. The guests included Mrs. Hampton, Patricia and her family, Chef Barrett, the original cafe staff, and others who had been part of the farm's journey. Sarah had prepared a cheese board, showcasing every variety they produced, including a new one she'd developed for her final school project. As twilight softened the Yorkshire hills, Margaret stood to address her guests. Looking around the room, she saw not just friends and colleagues, but a community that had grown around a shared passion for traditional food and farming. 2 years ago, she began, I thought this farm was all I had left. What I didn't realize was that it was all I needed to begin again. But what we've built here isn't just my achievement, it belongs to all of us. She spoke about Mrs. Hampton's wisdom and patience, about Patricia's eventual friendship and support, about Sarah's growth from curious teenager to confident young cheesemaker. She thanked Chef Barrett for his early faith in her products, Emma for her dedication to the shop, and all the local producers who had become part of the farm's extended family. After dinner, as people lingered over coffee and cheese, Margaret slipped away to the cave entrance. The wild strawberries were blooming. Again, their sweet scent mixing with the cave's ancient mineral air. She thought about Elizabeth's journal, about the generations of women who had worked this land before her. The sound of laughter drifted from the cafe, and Margaret smiled, remembering her first lonely days at the farm. She had gained so much, more than just a successful business. She had found her place in the world, her way of contributing to something larger than herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more visitors to welcome, more cheese to make, more traditions to preserve and pass on. Sarah would soon leave for university, but others would come, drawn by the same desire to learn and create. The farm would continue to evolve, finding new ways to bridge past and present. Standing there in the gathering dusk, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. The path ahead was clear now, not because she could see every step, but because she trusted her ability to find her way. She had learned that success wasn't about the size of your business or the money in your account, but about staying true to your values and creating something meaningful. The cafe lights glowed warmly against the darkening sky, beckoning her back to the celebration inside. As she turned to rejoin her guests, Margaret paused for one last look at her farm. The sturdy buildings, the well-tended fields, the caves holding their precious cargo. This small piece of Yorkshire had become more than just a home or a business. It had become a place where dreams could take root and grow, where tradition and innovation danced together, where a new story was being written every day. And her own story? It was still unfolding, rich with possibilities she had never imagined. But one thing was certain. She had found where she belonged, and in finding her place, she had helped others find theirs too.